Now, if we're talking about linear functions, some things we have to remember about the word linear is that it's a line, and a linear equation was always, for us to graph, was in y equals mx plus b. So that's an important thing that we have to remember, the y equals mx plus b. Now, with this, we have to remember that the m stood for the slope, which is always written as the rise over run or the y over x. Our b was our base or our y-intercept. And this was always written as 0, whatever that b value was, or whatever that number is for that b value. So it's always written as an intercept. When you see the word y-intercept, it's always written as an intercept. So in this case, we're now going to look at how we're going to use a graph to write a linear function that relates y to x. So we're going to look at this linear function, and we're going to say to ourselves, okay, what do I see that I can use here to help me find my y equals mx plus b? Well, in this case, I noticed that my y-intercept is located on the graph, which is 0, -3. I know I have to find my slope, and I find my y-intercept. So in this case, if I found my y-intercept is 0, -3, now my next thing is to find my slope. Well, we wrote that it's the rise over run. So if I were to start, because when I used to graph y equals mx plus b, I would start my y-intercept, and to find my next additional points, I would use my slope. So in this case, we're going to see how far it takes to get from this point to this point. So we're going to go up 1, 2, 3, and it's going up, so it's a +3 over 1, 2. So our slope is 3 over 2. So for us to write a linear function that relates y to x, we have to write it in y equals mx plus b. So our linear equation, our linear function, and it is a function because of the fact that it passes that vertical line test. So all the points on our line only goes through once, so it is a function. So this would be y equals 3/2 x minus 3. And that would be a linear function that relates y to x. Now this one says use a table to write a linear function that relates x to y. You can either choose to just look at the table, or you can graph it, but in this case we're really just going to look at the table. So remember that we have to get it into y equals mx plus b. So the first thing I always look is like, can I find the y-intercept? Is it located? Well, in this case, my y-intercept is 0, 3. So I'm going to write b equals 0, 3. And I noticed it was the y-intercept because I know that in a y-intercept, the x value is always 0. Now, to find my slope on a table, I'm going to figure out the difference between the numbers. So from -3 to -2, it's a +1. -2 to -1, +1. -1 to 0 is a +1. That is my x values, or my domains, my inputs in this case. Now my y values, my range or my outputs, I notice that you're subtracting 2 from each number. Now remember, you always write slope as y over x. So in this case, my slope is going to be -2 over 1, or just -2. So for me to write my linear function that relates x to y, it's going to be y equals a -2x plus 3. So that would be my answer. Now, if you wanted to use the graph, you could have done that where you graphed out the points and then found it that way. But I just wanted to show you how to use the table. Now we're going to put this into a real life scenario. So the table shows the amount of calories burned y after you have rock climbed x hours. So I always like to write what our x value is and what our y value is, just so that we know, or underline at least, what that is. So my x is the hours climbed and my y is my calories burned. So it's listed there. Now it says write a linear function And anytime you see the word linear function, it wants it to be in y equals mx plus b. So it wants us to write a linear function that relates the amount of calories to the hours you rock climb. Well, in this case, if I look at my table, I notice that I'm not seeing a y-intercept. So if we don't see a y-intercept, we have to think, okay, how can I figure out what this is? Now, I know I can at least try to find the slope from looking at my values. So I'm going to see what's the difference between 1,950 to 3,900. Well, I notice that's adding 1,950. And if you keep doing that, it's going to go up by that same amount. And I notice that this is plus 3, plus 3, plus 3. So my slope in this case is always my y over my x. So I have 1,950 over 3, which is going to simplify to 650. So far I have my slope. Well, if I have my slope and I have my points, I'm thinking I can either try to figure out by looking at the table what my y-intercept would be, or I could figure out by using point slope form, because I have my slope and I have my points. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this first point right here and use point slope form, which was, I'm going to write that over here, y minus y1 is equal to m times x minus x1. So if I have that, I'm going to use my point 3 comma 1,950, and I'm going to notice that I have y minus 1,950 equals 650 times x minus 3. So here's my equation. I'm now going to solve. So I have 650. I'm going to distribute that. So I have y minus 1,950 equals 650 times x, and then minus, it's going to be 1,950. Now to get y by itself, I'm going to add 1,950 on both sides. And if you notice, that's going to cancel both of these out. So my final equation would be y equals 650x, because there's going to be no y-intercept in this case. You could have also figured that out by looking that if I subtracted 3 or added 3 from my original point, it would have been 0. And if I subtracted 1,950, I would have got 0. So I would have had a point of 0, 0, which is the origin. So that's where mine's going to start. Now it says, how many calories have you burned after rock climbing for 20 hours? So I got to figure out, what does the 20 stand for? Is that my x or my y? Well, if I look at my chart, hours rock climbing is my x. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this equation, which is y equals 650, and I'm going to substitute that 20 in, because this is a function. So what I put in, which is my x, I'm going to get my y value. So in this case, the amount of calories that I would burn would be 13,000, because 650 times 20 is 13,000 calories.